Of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, arch-preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 26. Jimothy the Destrier did not have coherent and formed thoughts like the sentient creatures around him. He was a horse, after all. While the minds of animals were assumed to be much more basic, their inner workings were still a somehow unknowable thing. They had no reference for esoteric concepts like death, beauty, or justice, nor even such a notion as petty revenge against an insufferable rival. What Jimothy did have in his horse-shaped mind were pure instincts, desires, the only remaining knowledge of the secret location of Lord Honeyforge's missing fortune, and years of the finest military training a warhorse could receive. Thus, when commanded, in this case to bite a certain elf with an arrogant demeanour and obnoxiously loud perfume, it was not merely Jimothy's pleasure to do so, it was his duty. A duty which he enjoyed immensely, and would happily carry out, even if he wasn't ordered to do so. There was no malice or deeper thought behind it. Biting was what Jimothy did, and he did it better than anyone. And since Fraenk was not on the receiving side of it this time, he finally understood its appeal. He watched with satisfaction from Jimothy's back as the horse first grabbed, lifted, then throttled Fraenk Gingerglade like a child's sawdust doll. The power and ease with which the warhorse could toss this reprehensible elf around was godlike, akin to witnessing a miracle. Indeed, nearly everyone there, the partisans, Olwyn Brightrock, even the hell-touched man, gaped in wonder. And for a sublime moment, Fraenk had forgotten why he had even ordered such a thing. But hearing Farathiel's anguished screams brought it back. These grasping fernbrooks, the kidnapping of his preceptors, the wild search for the kobold, and now this final act of betrayal and cruelty at the lighthouse. The elf deserved every sharp incisor, but Fraenk knew if he didn't stop Jimothy soon, he would make everything far worse. And not just for himself. In what seemed like minutes, but was actually only moments, chaos erupted on the jetty as partisans grabbed for the horse, the yowling elf, and Neversleep at the same time. Jimothy, cease. Bad horse, no biting. Fraenk tepidly scolded before he was pulled to the ground. Fortunately, the horse either lost interest or obeyed. Fraenk Gingerglade fell from the height of Jimothy's open mouth and landed on the stones. He clutched his already swelling limb and continued to shriek.
"Ah, he broke my arm!"
Gingerglade kept repeating.
"Arrest him!"
While Fraenk was hauled roughly to the centre of the scrum, only a few of them moved to help the injured elf, who screeched and howled the moment anyone tried to see to his arm. One of the partisan lieutenants tried to offer a healing tincture to Fraenk, but he was caterwauling too much to drink it. Finally, Stanris of the Arcane Lord stepped forth, eager to test out a new healing spell. On his second casting, he managed to passably mend the fractures in the elf's bones and left it with only a slight bend. Fraenk shot Fraenk a murderous glare. Now it was Frank's chance to return a nasty grin. He decided that whatever they may do to him, this moment made it all worthwhile.
"I want this man arrested for assaulting an elf. I seek a full justice tribunal."
Fraenk Gingerglade snapped at Brightrock. The arch-partisan's eyebrows raised slowly. He did not take well being told what to do, least of all by the likes of Gingerglade. But whatever distaste he had was overridden by his sworn duty. Arch-partisan Brightrock nodded, and the burly partisan nearest to him seemed to magically manifest a pair of manacles, which would soon be on Frank's wrists. Only then did it occur to him that he could be in some serious trouble. He had to think of something quickly. "Sir, Gingerglade's kidnapped 3 elves," Fraenk blurted. Many eyes shot in Farathiel's direction. Fraenk didn't want to resort to this option, but he had little choice left. Crimes against an elf were very serious, and something he knew that Brightrock wouldn't overlook. If his preceptors were still alive, Fraenk hoped he could convince the partisans to do a thorough search of Fernbrook Estate to find them, and if they were dead already, then Farathiel would have some punishable crimes to answer for. Fraenk felt a tug at his elbow like one of the partisans was trying to pull him out of the crowd.
I don't know what you're talking about,
Farathiel said, sipping at the potion and making disgusted faces.
Besides, he's the one who should be in irons. Look what his beast did to me.
Then the elf gingerly raised the arm cradled in front of him, showing off the torn shirt sleeve for all to see. When he was convinced the crowd had enough time to witness, Farathiel winced dramatically and lowered it again. Yesterday he ordered his men to kidnap 3 of my preceptors, then told me he was holding them for ransom in return for finding that kobold, Fraenk went on.
Preposterous!
Farathiel scoffed out a derisive laugh. You'll find them within Fernbrook Manor, Fraenk continued. You'll need to search the place top to bottom. Fraenk saw a look of worry on Farathiel's face. Perhaps he knew that if the partisans moved quickly on this, they would have no time to hide the kidnapped elves. Or he was thinking about the abuse he'd received from Lord Fernbrook after allowing a full partisan raid on the estate, uncovering all manner of illicit activities.
Well, what of these men?
Brightrock demanded. Farathiel squirmed.
I haven't a clue what my good arch Neversleep is talking about. He's clearly been under difficulty and strain. Just look at the state of him.
What kind of elf values a kobold over the lives of his own kind? Fraenk went on, feeling someone stepping down uncomfortably on the toe of his boot. Who was this irritation? Just then, Jimothy suddenly wrenched free of the 2 partisans who were desperately trying to keep him under control. The horse reared back, front hooves slashing dangerously in the air. Men on all sides jumped back to avoid being struck. In the chaos, Fraenk felt a sharp ridge hand hit him directly in the kidney. The pain was immediate and intense. It was a move he taught his preceptors as a method of stunning an unwary foe in a crowd of people. He contorted and twisted around to see who had done it. Fraenk came face to face with a young partisan with a sweep of brown hair. His features were delicate, but he had very familiar brown eyes. "Gwen! Gods, that hurt!" Fraenk gasped, recognizing his vice-arch-preceptor, this time wearing the glamour of a city partisan. "Our men are safe. Read the skarking note." The young partisan with Gwen's voice growled, then abruptly turned and disappeared into the throng of soldiers. Beside him, Jimothy came down hard, then took off at a gallop. Several men dove out of the way to keep from being trampled. Olwyn Brightrock took a casual sidestep, just enough for the horse to miss him by a hair's breadth. They all watched as the great white beast went clattering back up the jetty and off to terrorize other parts of the city. During the distraction, Fraenk unfolded the paper. Gwen's handwriting was both neat and angry. It read, Preceptors, Matchers, Drimore and Spithe received tip of contraband gaze and white. Moved to intercept. Led on chase a day's ride out of Arathes. Found it was Fernbrook decoy, no powder. All accounted for at Blackroot Manor. Frank's cheeks flushed crimson at the final underlined words. Not kidnapped, idiot! A mix of giddy relief and embarrassment flooded him. Although Gingerglade had played him exquisitely, making him believe his men were taken. And, like a fool, Fraenk rushed headlong into doing the elf's dirty work. Fraenk always believed he was too smart to be manipulated so easily, but this was evidence to the contrary. He'd certainly dug himself into a sloss pit with this situation. Maybe Fraenk was an idiot. Fortunately, being an idiot did have its advantages, and Fraenk knew exactly how he was going to extricate himself from this situation. Of course, it would involve more buffoonery. He watched for a few more seconds, just as Gingerglade was really beginning to sweat under the partisans' questions. As much as Fraenk would like to see his enemy taken off to jail while partisans crawled over every inch of Fernbrook district, he knew they would likely find all manner of other crimes and contraband, but no kidnapped elves. It was not yet the time to take his retribution on the Fernbrooks. For now, Fraenk had to stop this from going any further. "Wait!" Fraenk shouted above the din. "My lord, I must apologize. I was mistaken." All eyes were on him once again. Fraenk sighed.
What's this about, Neversleep?
There was an edge of warning in Brightrock's voice. "I've just received word that my men are free," Fraenk said. "In fact, they're here with us now. Boys, come on out!" Fraenk pantomimed, looking around the crowd, while drawing up one of his hands behind his back. "Oh, here they come!" Fraenk drew out his hand and raised the three-fingered hand gesture generally considered so rude that even some dock workers and prisoners were squeamish about employing it. Fraenk gave Gingerglade an eyeful. A scandalized and bemused astonishment ran through the ranks of the partisans. To Farathiel's credit, he took the insult without flying into a rage or renewed calls for a tribunal. Fraenk could only assume this wasn't the first nor 100th time that Gingerglade received such an offence.
Are you quite finished, Neversleep?
Olwyn Brightrock asked, growing irritated. It's what he deserves for wasting my time and resources that could be better served in my district, Fraenk snapped. In fact, you're no longer welcome in Blackroot, Arch-Preceptor. See your way out before I have a few of my own men show you what we do with trespassers.
Enough!
The arch-partisan Brightrock snapped.
Form ranks. I'm tired of playing nursemaid to you two. Neversleep. Control your anger, or I will have you arrested. And you, Arch-Preceptor Gingerglade, see to your business and be gone. And before you object to being nibbled by a pony, I will tell you that you have no idea what a proper injury looks like.
He paused to glare, his breath moving through the ragged corner of his mouth. Mustering his dignity, Gingerglade straightened his robes, either having forgotten about his supposedly injured arm, or the healing drink had done its job, and he was no longer feeling pain.
Very well, I'll just take my lord's property and we'll go.
Farathiel's tone turned genteel and exuded reasonableness. Whatever his purpose for taking the kobold, Fraenk couldn't let this Fernbrook stooge gain anything that he had come all this way just to get. Sounds like he kept this kobold as a slave, Fraenk remarked loud for everyone to hear.
Ridiculous.
Farathiel sniffed, whether from some nasal irritation or mock emotion.
The kobold was actually a beloved servant of my Lord Fernbrook. He's been missing for many days and we'd like him to be returned to us. It's true he owed us a significant debt when he died, but with no other kin, his ledger is clear.
Couldn't find anyone else to pay for it, more like. The voice of partisan Gwen came from somewhere amongst their ranks. This drew a few chuckles. Then, pray tell, why do you require his body? Fraenk pointed his question at the elf. Are you going to sell it? Maybe have him stuffed and he can sit on the fireplace beside your master's favourite pipe? The subject of ownership of other intelligent species was a hot topic of discussion amongst the high-minded elven elite. They all, of course, held entire armies of servants in poverty wages, working long hours that left little time for their own lives. But at the same time, the notion of outright slavery was abhorrent to elves. All life was precious, after all. How did they justify this paradox? By publicly condemning slavers outside of the elite, including ones they themselves had patronized, and by crushing any suggestion of their own complicity in the ongoing problem. It required immediate and vehement denial.
What? No. This kobold was a cherished and well-cared-for servant of our great High Lord. He was a favourite, in fact, and treated with the utmost respect.
Farathiel blustered. If you loved him so much, then why did you send a bounty hunter and myself after him for stealing? Fraenk countered.
Well, we were very concerned for his safety, obviously, and too late, I might add.
Farathiel countered.
He is a member of our household, after all. We must see to the funereal rites.
As it shall be.
Arch-partisan Brightrock said, his patience obviously at an end.
Send the kobold on, with the arch-partisan of Fernbrook, that he may have rights and honours in accordance with kobold custom.
Farathiel gave a victorious sneer. Fraenk watched the small wrapped body being moved along to the Fernbrook men. He knew his goodwill with the arch-partisan was all but used up. Fraenk could not let them take the kobold. He had one final dice to roll. Of course you are right, sir, but shouldn't he be checked first? For bugs? Or black worms? Fraenk intoned. Brightrock met his gaze and an understanding passed between them.
Wait, he's right. The body must go to the city physicians first for a medical inspection.
Brightrock said.
There's been an outbreak of plague in the kobold town. I'd hate for your Lord Fernbrook to get infected by his beloved servant.
Farathiel sputtered, then went silent. Brightrock's word had always been unimpeachable, which is why it was so jarring for Fraenk to hear him lie like this. In an odd way, this might have been the most unsettling thing he had experienced in recent memory. Nevertheless, Fraenk felt a quiet relief as the kobold's body was taken back and loaded onto a partisan cart.
Well, if we can't take the kobold, what about our stolen property?
Farathiel chimed in with his reedy voice.
Lord Fernbrook should be able to recover his own rightful property from the little bugger, right? Have you even searched him?
Very well.
Brightrock answered.
What was taken?
A cold chill shot up Frank's spine. He knew before Gingerglade began to speak.
A trifle, really, but it reminds his lordship fondly of his dearly departed wife. The article is a simple pendant with a plain stone on a silver chain, imbued with a basic charm.
Farathiel was downplaying it as much as possible, but he was talking about the cold lump of dark magic in Frank's pocket. He was after the cursed pendant. They could search the dead kobold all they wanted. As long as Fraenk kept calm, they wouldn't discover it was actually in his possession.
We wouldn't even need to touch the little skiffer. We can locate it by detecting its magic.
Farathiel mused.
Sir Brimblade, you know the spell, correct?
Fraenk felt his bladder clench. He looked over at the two arcane lords to see if they were going to intervene in this use of magic, but they too were eager spectators. This situation had taken a sudden turn into bad territory. Fraenk wondered if there was a way he could slip out of the crowd unnoticed. Or save that, leap onto Jimothy's back and go thundering away, but of course the horse, prudently, had already left. The crowd of partisans moved aside as the hell-touched man stepped forward, predatory and dangerous. They seemed to instinctively withdraw from his hateful presence. Brimblade's seething orange eyes burned into Fraenk. He met the scary man's gaze and returned it with similar intensity. Despite his bravado, there was something that would soon be revealed, which would cast a very dim light on Fraenk, and would force him to answer some uncomfortable questions. Like, why did he have stolen Fernbrook property, and was Fraenk possibly working with this group of thieves? Of course, a smarter man may have opted to stash it someplace, any place really, that would keep it from falling into the hands of his sworn enemies. But considering how his fortune had been recently, Fraenk should have known better and taken more precautions. Was it really that unreasonable to expect to arrive at the lighthouse alone and find the kobold alive? Instead, the worst of all possibilities happened, and now his effort to protect the strange magical jewellery had turned to its greatest hazard. Fraenk cursed himself for not just hiding the damn thing in the Royal Museum when he had the chance. Now it would fall right into the hands of... He stopped. Fraenk suddenly had an idea. It was risky, but there was a chance it might work. If only the Lindblood woman would help him. And why wouldn't she? Especially after finding out Fraenk had been hired to hunt down her dead kobold, and that he had the necklace as well. Oh, this was a dubious plan. The moment the hell-touched Brimblade began to curl his fingers, invoking a spell to detect magical items, Fraenk stepped forward. There was a saying in the business of secrets and whispers. If you can't control the facts, at least control how everyone understood the facts. No need for that, good sirs. I have the item in question with me. Fraenk spoke loud and stuck out his closed fist. He turned it over, and there in his palm it sat, dull and lifeless, almost difficult to observe for any amount of time. It made the mind grow bored, and wander the longer one tried to look, like a squirrel bounding amongst the branches of a tree. Yes, squirrels, they were jolly, weren't they? Living carefree lives of... Fraenk snapped himself out of his reverie. He'd been staring off into the distance for a time, and so had all observers, it seemed. A quiet hush fell over the cluster of people around him. They were all looking away from the necklace, lost in thought. He closed his hand around it, and eyes seemed to refocus on him again. This is the article in question, yes? I recovered it at the scene of a murder. Fraenk shot a pointed look at Farathiel. He could see hunger and greed in the elf's gaze. So the Fernbrooks had seen this before, Fraenk realised. That was interesting, and this... all of this, from the killing of his friend to the farcical standoff at the wizard's lighthouse. It had all been for the necklace.
Our Lord Fernbrook is grateful to Arch Neversleep for the safe return of our property.
The other preceptor preened. I'm happy to return it to its rightful owner. Fraenk grinned back and extended his hand towards Olwyn Brightrock. "See, this makes its way back to the Royal Museum of Arathis." Farathiel Gingerglade's triumphant smile curdled.
What? No, I just told you Lord Fernbrook is its owner.
Farathiel protested and reached for the necklace. "It's stolen museum property," Fraenk said. Arch-partisan Olwyn Brightrock's fist closed around it like a vault door slamming, and was just as secure. In that moment, Fraenk could not have been more grateful for that grizzled old battle-hammer of an incorruptible, law-abiding elf. Unlike so many of the ruling class who spoke epic poems about character and virtue, this was one who actually lived it, which was maddening at times, but in this moment, glorious.
"I'll require you to explain yourself, Neversleep, but be brief and to the point,"
Brightrock said. The surrounding partisans were riveted. This drama was better than anything at the Royal Opera. Even the men who were holding the woman with the black bag on her head had paused to listen. "I'm willing to grant that Lord Fernbrook might have been its owner for a short time, but he's not its original owner. It was stolen first from the Royal Museum before it entered his possession, then later stolen from him by the kobold," Fraenk went on.
Lies! Filthy lies and slander against a High Lord of Arathis!
Farathiel's voice pitched in a vehement fit of pique. "I'm not accusing a High Lord of thievery, nor that he paid others to steal on his behalf." Fraenk shot Farathiel a knowing look. "Perhaps he purchased it afterward, innocent of the knowledge of the necklace's sordid path to him. Either way, it's not his possession, it belongs to the museum."
I still insist that it is rightfully and fairly property of Lord Fernbrook. So it becomes a question of who you will believe, arch-partisan. The word of a human...
Farathiel spat the last word out like a rotten bite from a bitter stone apple.
Or the word of an elf.
"Perhaps you'd be persuaded by the word of a human and a Linblood," Fraenk countered. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Linbloods were a rare kind of creature who held a charmed place somehow above even elves. The irony was, of course, that Fraenk was relying on her virtue whilst simultaneously impugning her character. She might dash his pickstick army with one swipe of her foot. He could only hope her vitriol for the Fernbrooks would outweigh all else. "Go on and ask her," Fraenk urged.
"Bring the woman forward."
Olwyn Brightrock hissed through the broken side of his mouth. Moments later, a trembling figure was set in their midst. With a single motion, the black hood was swooped off her head, and a breathless inhale came from several in the crowd. Even though she had been crying for who knows how long, her face was still beautiful. Perhaps even more so in her heartbreak. Fraenk, too, found himself drawn in, feeling her pain, radiant and pure. Her red-rimmed eyes twitched open, and she cast about wildly at all present until they finally found his. The look she gave was akin to the illustration he had seen of the hateful, glowing blue glare of a mummified, vigor-broken ice panther ready to kill. He almost jumped back.
"Curses upon you, Neversleep. May every foul beast in this world and the next tear the flesh from your bones."
She spat in fury. A manful "ooh" rose from the jocular partisans. They were enthralled by this hellcat of a woman, and in particular her loathing of Fraenk. Arch-partisan Brightrock raised his hand yet again for silence, then fixed her with a look that demanded honesty.
"Speak true, woman. The punishment for lying will be quite severe. Are you and the others part of a thievery cabal who is responsible for stealing valuables around Arathis?"
Arch-partisan Brightrock mocked. Frank's stomach tightened. If she denied this now with a reasonable alibi, she may go free, and his entire plan for keeping the necklace out of the Fernbrooks' hands would blow away like ash. Most were inclined to believe that the Linbloods were instinctively drawn to be right and good anyway. It was much more of a stretch to see them as someone who flouted the laws. But as the expression went, the arrow had left the bowstring. All Fraenk could do now was hope it hit the target.
Careful how you answer, miss.
Farathiel interjected as if to counsel her.
He's asking you to confess to criminal acts. You'll end up in prison.
"So, what of it? You thinkin' I'm a-scared?"
She growled.
"I freely confess that we's the best there is at thievin'. Nothing we can't lift."
There was something surprising about the way she spoke, Fraenk observed quietly. It wasn't like their first encounter. She'd picked up some street lingo and seemed to be affecting a passable but not great Tigranean accent. From the faces of those around him, Fraenk could see that none seemed to notice. They were all the more drawn in by the luridness of this fallen Lindblood, with her tear-stained cheeks and mucousy nostrils. Grief threatened to bubble forth, but she forced it back with an angry snarl. Arch-Partisan Brightrock motioned for quiet to the chatter and posed his next question.
And where was this stolen from?
He held out his fist and let the stone of the pendant dangle in the air. Her eyes locked onto it, then back to Fraenk. A look of hurt and betrayal passed over her face. You had this, and didn't tell me? How could you? Fraenk felt a rare pang of guilt. She had only been trouble for him, and was, even now, the central figure in this drama, and the cause of his having to give up the dangerous necklace. But she did save his life from the Black Hound, and there was some deep, inner, lonely part of him that saw something in her. But what?
From the Fernbrooks, of course. My partner swiped it right from their strongbox.
She levelled a malicious glare at Fraenk again. Oh, this was bad, Fraenk thought. She's serving the necklace right into the hands of Farathiel and Lord Fernbrook. Maybe there was some deep malice she felt towards him, even one to outweigh her disdain for the elves. Fraenk felt hope slip away as Arch Brightrock gathered up the necklace in his hands again, ready to hand it to a jubilant Farathiel Gingerglade.
But that was after they refused to pay us for stealing it in the first place.
A wicked grin curled on her face.
That's a brazen lie.
Farathiel sputtered.
It's the Brands, honest. They were swore to pay us 5,000 gold for stealing it from the Royal Museum. A display of Queen Phelan casses, I do believe. I didn't look too close on account of us nipping it and getting out.
All eyes shifted to Lord Fernbrook's uncomfortable emissary. All eyes except Fraenk and the Lindblood woman. He could only gape open-mouthed in amazement at her masterful play. She met his gaze, and he caught a faint smile curl at the corner of his mouth. Then she winked. The Lindblood woman, Kyla, Fraenk now remembered her name, turned her vitriol back to Farathiel.
They cheated us, and so we took it back. Now they sent their dirty goons to kill us.
No!
Farathiel screamed and launched himself forward, grasping for the jewellery. Arch-Partisan Olwyn Brightrock gripped the necklace back and mounted his horse as the partisans grabbed and subdued the enraged preceptor. Fraenk could see that was the moment his judgment had been rendered.
Take the woman into our most secure cells to keep her safe until the tribunal, and I will speak with the curators at the Royal Museum about their missing article,
the elf pronounced, wheeling his stately horseback from the scrum. In a matter of minutes, the arch and vice-arch partisans rode back down the jetty, carrying the necklace, Kyla, and the body of the kobold, Possu Faljarn. It was a Nadumian victory, to be sure. Neither side won, and both left burned, but at least his enemies had not ended up with the necklace. Fraenk found himself left alone with a seething arch-preceptor Farathiel Gingerglade and the hell-touch bounty hunter Sorzon Brimblade. Even Fraenk's disguised secondary, Gwen followed in line with her apparent cohort. There was no one to back Fraenk up now, but nevertheless he felt charged and ready to face a dragon. Then a sort of standoff ensued. I trust you'll see yourselves out of my district now, before something unfortunate befalls you, good sirs. Our district is home to all types of unsavoury characters as of recently, and I most certainly cannot vouchsafe your health here. Fraenk took a swig from the bottle in his cloak. He could hear the sea-birds circling overhead, and the sound of wind flapping at the men's robes. For a moment it looked like violence might erupt. Farathiel looked mad enough to murder him, but Fraenk was confident he could best the elf in a straight-up fight. The Hell-Touched, on the other hand, was cut from a tougher hide. Fortunately, there were still too many partisans in the near vicinity to keep the Fernbrook goons from trying anything.
Your troubles have just started, Neversleep. Let's go.
Farathiel spat and turned with the whip of his robes. The hell-touched, narrowed, orange, hateful eyes at Fraenk, as if to warn of an impending fatal calamity destined forthwith. Fraenk returned the look, vowing an equal preemptive action. Goodbye, Fart, and don't come back without my say-so. Neither of you. Fraenk pointed at them in turn. He knew there would be devious and devastating repercussions from the Fernbrooks. For this, the brokered truce was now null and void. But right now, Fraenk wanted to revel victorious in this moment. He stood, sipping from his bottle, and watching the two Fernbrook enemies slink away. Fraenk hardly noticed as a ratty-looking crow flopped down to land on a post nearby.
Well played, Neversleep.
An avian voice, if there was such a thing, cawed from beside him. Fraenk turned and no other person was there. Just a large, gangly black bird. "Excuse me?" Fraenk asked.
We need to talk.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.